To God be the glory, great things he has done. So loved him the world that he gave us his son, who yielded his life and atonement for sin, and opened the life gate that all may go in.
Thanks for tuning in to No Trash, Just Truth, a podcast of Proverbs 9:10 Ministries.
With your hosts, Chris Paxson and Rose Spiller. Be sure to check out our other podcast, 5 a.m. Theology, available on all platforms.
And give him the glory, great things he has done.
Welcome back. As many of you who listen regularly have seen, sometimes we make plans and God calls an audible. Last week, we mentioned that we were beginning our summer rewind this week, where we are revisiting some of our favorite episodes while Rose and I are writing curriculum to go along with our book, The Bible Blueprint. But God laid a wonderful opportunity before us, and we could not pass this up.
No, we couldn't. For a couple years now, 3 of my grandkids and some of their friends have been urging us to interview their Christian Worldview teacher on this podcast because of the impact that she's had on their lives. And it worked out that we were able to do it this week. So we're going to push the summer rewind off till next week. And bonus, everyone gets a free episode and a brand new episode this week. So Chris and I are welcoming Mrs. Ann Sheridan on our podcast, who's been teaching Christian Worldview at the homeschool co-op Wisdom Builders for the past 12 years.
And we're thrilled to have Ann on the show. So just a little bit about her. Ann describes herself as an ambassador for Christ, and we're going to let her expound on that herself shortly. But she graduated from Michigan State and obtained her master's degree from the University of Illinois. Before becoming a mom and teaching, she worked as a hospital administrator. But for the last 12 years, like you mentioned, Rose, Ann has been teaching worldview classes to middle school through high school students. So Ann, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, Ann, let's start talking about you. Tell us about yourself. How did you become a Christian? How did you go from hospital administrator to teacher?
I laugh often when my students ask me questions about careers because my life has taken a very circuitous route. I didn't even become a Christian until I was about 30 years old. I grew up in really more of a sacramental liturgical denomination, and theology and religion were really the 2 classes in school that I ever didn't very well in. Always had an interest in that. Went to Michigan State and got a degree in communications, and then graduated from the University of Illinois as a speech language pathologist. And so I practiced in adult neuro for quite a while, kind of got on a management track, and then found myself as a hospital administrator. I didn't get saved until I was 30, as I said. It was something grace was something I didn't understand, the grace of the Lord. I was very much a works kind of an individual. I tend to be more of a type A personality. So doing was real big with me. But I came to a point in my life where I realized it's done and I can't do. And the person who was really instrumental in that was my husband's father. He actually was a large animal vet in West Michigan, and he would let me ride around in the truck with him when he'd go on calls. Dairy cows and horses were his area specialty, and I asked every religious question I could think of under the sun, and he was patient, and he had good humor, and he kept pointing me back to the Bible. And just over time, I realized I needed Jesus, and I needed forgiveness. And boy, did that change everything. My husband and I were married for another 8 years before we decided it was family time. And we ended up adopting a beautiful girl from China, a little baby. And that was really how I stepped out of the medical field because we realized she needed mom and dad at home. And so it was a very natural flow to move from bringing her home into this idea of home education, because at 10 and a half months, she'd never heard anything but Mandarin. So we were starting over from scratch with everything, things like eating, and she wasn't sitting up, didn't know, what any of the words meant. So it was just a very natural thing. And my dearest friend and mentor, who I think is probably the smartest woman I've ever met, she was homeschooling, and she just sort of let me observe. At first, I sort of thought, she's losing her mind. What is she thinking, schooling these kids at home? Back when I was a hospital administrator. And I remember thinking, how are you ever going to get a good education? But after I began to dabble, I quickly realized that was the wrong question. The right question I should have asked was, how am I ever going to make up my mind between all this amazing resource availability? There was so much. And we realized very quickly, God was telling us, protect her mind and heart, meaning my daughter. And so homeschooling for us was a very, very easy and natural progression.
I think you touched on a stigma of homeschooling, and it's always that, they're not socialized and they don't really have an education. And I think that probably can be true, but I mean, you go to public school and you got the same thing. It can be a great experience or a really terrible experience. But yeah, I
Yeah,
think you hit on a stigma that is out there.
it's definitely a stigma, and I have a lot of educators in my family in public school. So it's a real stigma. And John and I did not do it with our kids, but we knew people that did it really well, and we knew people that did it really poorly.
Mhm.
So I can see kind of why the stigma might be there, but it's not reality for everybody.
I agree. And I think that number one ingredient in all of it, regardless of the educational environment, is the parents' involvement. I think that's huge.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So, Anne, you call yourself an ambassador for Christ, and you say that you fulfill that through the teaching of the middle school and the high school students on this Christian worldview. Can you start by giving a brief explanation to our listeners of what a worldview is, how the Christian worldview is unique, and how our worldview affects our lives? And then tell us what made you specifically decide to teach that.
Okay, well, why don't we start with the term worldview? I think it's a term that's thrown around a lot, but really at its most basic, a worldview is the set of beliefs and values and ideas that each one of us hold inside that help us both see the world and make sense of what is going on around us. The funny part about a worldview is that all worldviews basically have something to say about God, about truth, about the universe, about people, and about right and wrong. And that is across the board, whether I'm talking about secularism or Islam or Marxism. And the other funny thing about worldviews, John Stonestreet, the president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, is famous for saying that a worldview is a lot like a cold. You catch it from someone else. Everyone has a worldview, but most people don't realize they do because a worldview is held so deeply within us. I sort of liken it to a pair of contact lenses. For those who wear contact lenses, you put them on your eye and you look through them, but you never stop to think all day long that they're floating there and you're looking through them. If you have the wrong prescription, you can't see the world and make sense of what's going on. But if you have the right prescription, you see things clearly and reality as it is. And so, I liken a worldview to this idea that we all have sets of beliefs. Now, a worldview is about ideas. We get ideas from information. So I'm fond of telling my students that no information is neutral because every piece of information you receive comes from a human being and it's got a worldview behind it because every human has a worldview. And the other piece that I try to drive home to my students, your grandchildren would probably be able to finish this phrase, ideas have consequences, is that because worldviews are about ideas, worldviews drive our choices. And so the types of values, ideas, and beliefs that you hold in your worldview are going to then determine the choices that you make, which is why we spend so much time in the college preparatory series trying to study the competitors to worldview so that when a student enters the workplace or an army barracks or the academic setting at the American university, they're not gobsmacked by some of this behavior they see or statements professors are making because they're able to listen to that and understand, that belongs to this set of ideas, or to be able to look at a behavior someone is exhibiting and roll that behavior back to its seed bed, its worldview.
R.C. Sproul, in one of his most famous books, says ideas have consequences. I think you're right, Anne. Everyone has a worldview. Everyone has a theology, whether they know it or not. And, a lot of what you're talking about is discernment. I mean, it seems like that's pretty much where you're going. And I'm curious, why do you think it's necessary that we start kids critically thinking about their worldview at, say, middle school level?
How much time have you got?
As long as you need.
I have several answers to that. The first one, and I think the most important one, is that we do not have time to wait anymore. Used to be 10, 15, 20 years ago, those kinds of discussions, we'll wait and we can have with them when they're 16, 17. But technology's changed everything. Those glowing screens that we carry around in our pockets have given a plethora, legion of voices that are now speaking to us and into our children's hearts and minds. And they're all trying to compete for their allegiance. And behind each of those voices, as I said earlier, is a worldview. So it's not that we're just piping in all these influencers, it's that we're piping in now a smorgasbord of options of plausibility, things that we couldn't even have imagined were going to be possible to consider as real 20 years ago. 12 and 13-year-olds now are growing up in a world where what was once unthinkable is now unquestionable. And that's a monstrosity to think about. I think the second reason is that we live in an emotive culture. Critical thinking is declining across the board. And there are a myriad of reasons for that we could talk about. But I think that because critical thinking takes work, it's a linear activity. It's harder to think through ideas. It's harder to take an idea and think, well, where am I going to be if I follow this idea to its logical end? It's harder to go after source documents. It's harder to sit down and spend time finding counsel or searching the word. We live in a culture of instant gratification, and we live in a culture of outrage. We are primed to respond with our emotions instead of with our minds. And I think this is especially problematic for individuals who are between the ages of 12 and 19, because physiologically, the frontal lobes of their brain will not be completely developed until they're 25. And that's the area of the brain that's controlling things like inhibition, understanding risk assessment, the other executive functions. And they're all being encouraged through social media and through headlines and the way our news has crossed over into an entertainment venue now, that they're all being pushed in an emotive direction. So I think it's really, really important to understand that critical thinking doesn't come easily. It must be habituated. And so that's part of the way I view myself as an ambassador of Christ, because loving the Lord well is loving him with our heart, soul, and mind. And I want to teach the students that Christianity has always claimed to be a source of knowledge and truth, and that Christianity has something to say about every area of your life, which, if we discuss the classes themselves, I can make clear. But by doing that, I want to alter the way that they think. Too many people in our culture, people who claim the moniker of evangelical Christians, are a 2-hour-a-week hobby. I mean, people think your faith is for 2 hours on Sunday, and then you put it back on the shelf and you go live in the real world. That's a lie. And if that is how you're looking at your faith, I don't mean anyone offense, but that sounds more like a hobby to me. Christianity is built to be a way of life. And that is my goal. One of my goals is to offer this as a complete way of living. I think it builds a structure, a framework, it builds peace. And it's definitely a way to approach the world with wisdom and learning to love the Lord with your mind.
Wow, that's some great stuff.
Yeah,
So,
it is.
along that line, what are some questions that you ask the kids to get them thinking about their worldview?
Well, I think the most important, there are 4 basic questions that from the beginner level that we just start trying to get the kids thinking about. The first one, I think, is the most important. I tell them keep this in their back pocket at all times. And it's the question, what do you mean by that? Why is that the most important question?
Good question.
Because the words in our culture change definitions every 5 minutes. And I think that's really important. If you think love means this, and the person you're conversing with thinks love means that, you're not starting from a place of understanding. Our goal with critical thinking is never to do a gotcha. It's always to establish understanding, to build a bridge, because that's what an ambassador does. And so we want to understand how the people that we are dealing with are thinking so that we can help get them to think about what they think. One of my favorite things to do with the college worldview kids that are in the first year of college prep is to show them some videos. I incorporate a lot of media with that group. And so I'll show them videos about popular words. What does socialism mean? Or what does this mean? And it's stunning when they watch young people who don't have a definition. And one of the things I tell them is, you have to understand what words mean so that you can establish understanding. That is part of loving the Lord with your mind. You've got to know what you think and why you think it. So I want them using the questions, questioning themselves. Another question that I ask is, how do you know that to be true? Because I want an individual to begin to think when they make a statement, well, how do I know that's true? And then we proceed with, well, where did you get your information? Because one of the things I tell them is Facebook, TikTok, and Insta, they're not my go-tos for source documents. Again, it's trying to break them out of that instantaneous, instant gratification that technology has brought us. Thinking needs to be something that takes time and it takes searching. So these questions kind of get them rolling. And then the fourth basic question is, well, what happens if you're wrong? And I want the students not to ask these questions again out of a gotcha. That's something we talk about all the time. We want to get people to think about what they think. And I want them to think about what they think. Because you know what? I've been wrong on a lot of things. And I've evolved on things. And my students will evolve on things. That's not a bad thing. Because as you grow older, one of the things that, I think that's beautiful about walking with the Lord is our lens of truth only grows as we mature with the Holy Spirit. And so I think sometimes they're afraid to examine their own thinking. Well, what if I think something wrong? Well, then correct it. It's okay. We're all human.
Yeah, I think that's very important.
Yep. And then from there, we just build on those basic questions and we start thinking about in the later college years, if you find yourself in a dorm room with someone who vehemently disagrees with you or, anywhere out in the marketplace of ideas, questions like, well, do you think that's the whole story? Tell me how you came to this conclusion. Again, all information gathering. I tell my students never, if somebody makes a statement, and Sheridan's a liar, never make a statement back. Ask a good question. Never miss an opportunity that asking a good question is going to do for you. That's how we stay, you stay out of petty disagreements. Somebody says something and then someone says, no, it's not. Yes, it is. No, it's not. That's not how we go about it. Never make a statement when a good question will do the job for you.
Yeah, that's the way to definitely get more and more information about what the person believes. And thinking about that, what would you say is the most competing worldview out there for, in our culture today? What's the most tempting one for kids to succumb to in America or in the world?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And when I begin to teach the college prep class for kids who are in high school, I tell them 15 years ago, I would have told you that secularism, even 20 years ago, that secularism was the default Western worldview. But I really believe that postmodernism has supplanted that. And I think, especially if you look at so much of the news that is going on around us, even as I think about now what's happening in Los Angeles, postmodern neo-Marxism is really making a comeback. Marxism is what our textbook calls the zombie worldview. It just won't die. It keeps coming back. And it concerns me. Secularism, again, it's a pool, it's a stew of things. Secularism will always be there. But I really think this idea that there is no such thing as the truth, only my truth. Postmodernism has in American society won the day. And I think with time, it too will fall. And already people are talking about maybe a postmodern culture. What that looks like yet, I haven't quite figured out. But this idea that we're post-truth, I, of course, would vehemently oppose that.
I'm not sure what that means, post-truth.
Well, that there is no objective truth.
Oh,
that is
gotcha.
true for all
Yeah,
people, for all
so
places, at all.
relativism.
Yes. And I think this idea that we're seeing a mix of postmodernism and this cultural, or what I would call neo-Marxism, that really got its start with the Frankfurt School and Herbert Marcuse in the 60s, it's really inculcated our American universities, and we're seeing a lot of young people. That's why so many of these ideas are coming together, and so many of these protests we've seen across the country.
And the lack, I'm sorry.
Oh, go right ahead.
I was just going to say the lack of strong theological teaching in our churches is just feeding it.
I agree. And the other thing I think that stands shoulder to shoulder with that is the lack of critical thinking, the inability to examine ideas and think about, is the culture going to be better off? Are humans going to flourish if we take this idea to its logical endpoint?
You were saying that you ask questions instead of just coming back with a retort. And that's really what the culture has gone into. If someone says something you don't like, you just attack them instead of trying to debate it and talk about it and find out where you're both coming from. It's just attack and run. And social media is a great way to hit and run people.
Yeah, and I'm often teased by my friends that being an oldie moldy because I'm not on social media. But again, because so much of our news has crossed a line into entertainment, anything that happens on social media of note will make the news. So I tend to stay on top of things in spite of that. But your point is well taken. It is people throwing out assertions, and then someone throws an assertion back at them. And when you begin to dig gently with some thoughtful questions, people don't think about what they say, and they don't really have an idea why they believe what they do. And that's our opportunity, one life at a time, to begin to put a pebble in their shoe. You know how you feel when you get a pebble in your shoe? You're like, I got to do something about that. Well, that's the same thing we can do with ideas, with truth. And it is going to be a one life at a time thing. And I do think in the years ahead of us as Christians, a lot of the work that we do is going to be picking up the pieces of the destruction of these bad ideas, because ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims.
Yeah, and I love your idea of one life at a time, because I think so often we try to address a subject for everybody on social media who sees your comment, your great theological comment, to change. But one life at a time is what we're really looking at.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen, they have sometimes a reporter will go out to these college protests, and whether they're pro-Palestinian or they're protesting whatever, it'll say like Trump is a fascist or Republicans are fascists. And they'll ask them, well, what is a fascist? Well, I don't know, or why are you pro-Palestinian? And they don't know. They're like, I don't know why. And they'll ask their friend, why are we pro-Palestinian? Like, I mean, sadly, they're sheep in a bad way. They're sheep, not Jesus is sheep. They're sheep. They don't know why they believe what they believe. They're just following the crowd.
And your point really brings me back to the scripture verse that is really the foundation for all that I teach, and it's Colossians 2:8. And it says, see to it that no one takes you captive with deceptive philosophy or pseudo-intellectual babble that comes from the mere musings of men and the traditions of this world rather than on Christ. And one thing I stress to the students is the first three words of that verse are the most important. See to it. Whose job is it to guard your mind and heart and to think critically? It's yours. Paul is admonishing us. And if ever there was an age of deception, it's now. And in a war, you're one of two things. You're either a victor or you've been taken captive. And I want them to see that they should not be taken captive. And it's very possible by loving the Lord with your mind and thinking well.
Yeah, we're not life verse people, but if you're going to pick one, that's a good one to pick.
It's a very good one.
Yep.
So can you walk us through basically what you teach at each grade level, just an overview?
Sure. The first class, this year actually be the first year I'm not teaching the starter, the beginner class anymore. I've wrestled with that over the last 3 years and just really feel led that I've got to focus on this middle high school group. So the first class is called Worldview Intermediate, but I'm going to have to change the name because it's the starter, the entry class. The goal of this class is to take a 30,000-foot view of Christianity and how it applies to the 10 most common academic disciplines a student is going to encounter at the American University, in life, in the marketplace of ideas, or in an army barracks, in the workplace, because these are the areas that are generating so many questions, areas like ethics, philosophy, sociology, psychology. I think the central question right now the Western world is grappling with is the question of psychology. What does it mean to be human? And technology is offering so many alternative answers for us. So we look at these 10 disciplines, and the goal of this class is to teach the students fundamentally Christianity has something to say and is applicable to every area of life. It is not just about God. The springboard for all worldviews is to answer the question, what about God? Because even if you're an atheist materialist and you say, I'm a secularist or a Marxist, you have a theology. It's atheism. And that theology will affect your view of philosophy, which you think is real. It will affect your view of origins, biology. It will affect how you think we should use our resources, economics. So all of these things we take a look at and we understand what is the Christian position, so that, again, they come away understanding, wow, Christianity isn't just for 2 hours on a Sunday. It's for everything. And we take our positions on economics, on history, on sociology from the Word. This isn't just something Christians sat around and made up. We go to the Word and we can understand private property has, from the Old Testament, been a blessing from God. It is a good thing, and that hard work can earn blessing. So that's really the beginning. Each of these disciplines, as I said, asks a different question, and Christianity's got solid answers to each of the questions these areas ask.
Amen to that.
And then we move to what's called the College Prep Series. And the first year, we spend studying the competitors to Christianity. We study Islam, we study secularism, we study new spirituality, we study postmodernism, and we study Marxism. And the strength of this curriculum from Summit Ministries, I can't say enough about them. I just think they're amazing. They let the source documents and the worldview thinkers in these areas do the speaking. It's not Summit telling you what Islam believes. We look at portions of the Quran. It's not Summit telling you what Karl Marx said. We go to his work, the Communist Manifesto, and read that for a source document. So these students are getting a fundamental understanding. Now, we ask 5 basic questions of all of these worldviews we're looking at, so that the students come away with understanding. What are their sources of revelation? What does it mean to be human, or what is humanity? What is wrong with us? Because each of the worldviews has a different answer to that question. If you ask a new spiritualist, it's because what's wrong with us is that we haven't recognized the divinity in us. If you ask someone who's a Marxist, what's wrong with us? It's the capitalists in society. So they all have different answers to that. And then we look at another really important question. How does each of these worldviews tell us that we should live? And then finally, how does each of these worldviews understand the other worldviews? So that we're comparing apples to apples, asking the same question, and they come away with a fundamental idea of the belief system of these most common competitors to Christianity. And then the second year, the hard work starts. We take all 6, the competitors in Christianity, and we look at each of those 10 academic disciplines again, and we look at how each approaches. So what is the approach of new spirituality and Islam and Marxism, etc., to ethics? What's their approach to sociology, how we should live together? What's their approach to history? What's their approach to psychology? So by the end, students have an ability to look at behavior and begin to roll it back to its ideology, because right actions are always preceded by right thinking. And we want the students to be able to anchor what they're seeing and hearing and not be afraid or gobsmacked by things, but be able to analyze it and understand, oh, okay, I get where that's coming from. And that's kind of fun when I have students come back to me after having been in college for a year, and they're like, oh, Mrs. Sheridan, I had this new age professor and they did this, but I was able to handle it and I could question. And so, this very fun is fulfilling. Or when a parent comes back to me and says, I had a parent tell me this a couple of weeks before the school year ended, her son was graduating from college, and she said, all he ever does is ask questions. What do you mean by that? How do you know this is true? It's driving me crazy. And I was laughing and I said, I think I've done my job. But
Exactly.
it's fun, or my daughter will tell me, Mom, you've ruined me. I can never watch a movie again without asking worldview questions. And I'm like, I've done my job, because media is so stealth at smuggling in ideas for us to consume while we swallow a plot. And I want the students to understand.
That's that funny. My kids over the years they'll roll their eyes at me and like, oh, Mom, can you just let something go? And I'm like, no, I can't.
Yep.
No.
Yep. And then the third class is taking all this wonderful stuff that they've learned, and we say, okay, so how do I put it to use? What do I do in a dorm when I'm rooming with this person I don't know and they're diametrically opposed and they hate Christians, or I have a professor, or we start talking about how do we equip students? How do we actually apply this biblical worldview with others? And one of the fun things about this is I bring in guest speakers so they can see, what does it look like to have a biblical worldview and be a cop? Let's talk about abortion in depth. So I'm going to bring in the Crisis Pregnancy Center director and let her tell them about what goes on and what is the truth about mifepristone, and, what's a man's role in all of this. So, and they have a chance to dialogue then, and then, ask the questions and see, how does the rubber actually meet the road? And I think that is useful because we begin to talk more about things like just war theory, the use of force. What does this thing called justice mean in society? And, what are the opposing views? And then what does it look like to be a police officer who's got to, walk through all of that? And how does your worldview help you? Because I think when they can see other individuals striving for Christ, who are ordinary people doing extraordinary things for him, it gives them courage. Young people just need to see exemplars of individuals who are doing this. And they're not fancy, famous people. Again, they're just ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And that lights a fire in them.
I love that.
I do too. I think it's so great because it really shows them people walking it out.
Yes.
So, Anne, you and Rose discussed our theology, which was Reformed. How does teaching a Christian worldview from a Reformed perspective probably differ slightly from a non-Reformed teaching on a Christian worldview?
That's a hard one. I'm not sure that I personally understand the Reformed difference.
Well, I would think from a Reformed view, you would emphasize God's sovereignty. Obviously, you do emphasize the authority of Scripture. We would emphasize the total depravity of man.
Definitely.
And, the transformational power of salvation through the Holy Spirit. And some of that realms into an explanation of why we can't expect non-Christians to act like Christians or really have any desire to do so.
Now I understand what you mean. Most definitely, one of the things that I think is so important is when we talked about this idea of putting a pebble in people's shoes. We don't want to be prideful. We want to understand. And one of the things we talk about right out of the starting gate is this idea that, we are made in God's image, and that means everyone. But we're marred by sin. And if you don't have a saving relationship with Christ, you cannot be expected to act as a Christ follower. Thus, we are ambassadors, and we make our appeal for Christ by using the word and knowing the word. And that's a struggle for young people because they're all so busy, and that's something that I constantly come back to them. You can't grow in wisdom if you aren't bathing in the word. We don't grab these ideas out of thin air that guide us as Christians. As I said earlier, all of the positions that we take come out of the word. But we have to grasp ourselves that even though we're image bearers, we are marred. And without Christ, we can't save ourselves. So we have to make our appeal to the people around us. And one of the things I say to the students too is, I think you're dealing with a lot of people in our culture now who don't know about Christ, even in America, and that shocks them. I go through the biblical worldview inventory that's done out west, George Barna's group, and when I show them the percentage of individuals who even claim the moniker evangelical Christian who don't know the fundamentals of the faith, what does that mean for all the people who have never darkened the doorstep of a church, of which there are quite a few if you look at the growing percentage of the NONES, the nuns in this country, who don't claim any spiritual affiliation and are almost 30% of the population. So we use critical thinking and what we have learned about the Christian worldview to get people to begin to just crack that door. Because if we can help them to understand that maybe they're not thinking correctly in one area and kind of get them open to truth, the whole point of that is to then start walking them to the truth. And I see a real trend in this country of young men who are becoming very interested in, quote, conservative or spiritual things. I made a comment to a pastor just a couple weeks ago. I said, conservative influencers like Charlie Kirk, they're bringing a lot of young men to the front lawn of conservatism. I said, we need people to take them by the hand now and walk them through the door to Jesus.
Absolutely.
And that is, I think, that's our end goal. We want to establish conversation, but because there are so many people who don't, I think in our country now, especially young people who just don't have any understanding of Jesus, of one but many, in a theological smorgasbord, we need to start first by helping them understand just basic truths and reality, and then begin to walk them toward Christ. So I think there's a lot to be said for establishing a footpath, and then offering them who the author of truth is.
I think you make a great point. 50 years ago, probably almost everyone would know the basics of creation and the basics in Genesis, whereas now you have to start way back at creation because they just don't know.
Yep. And so many of the universal distinctions that God lays out in the first chapters of Genesis, we've just crashed through in American society. And, I've mentioned to my students before, you all grew up in a generation where Roe versus Wade was legal. I remember it was like before it was legal. I said, but you have to keep in mind now, you have people coming behind you that are growing up in a culture that believes a girl can become a boy and a boy can become a girl. And they think that's plausible and normative. And to look at their faces. So these are the kinds of things that we deal with. And I truly believe until we can form a dialogue and we can introduce people to the truths of Christianity and help them think about what they think and why, then we have a chance to walk them to the author of truth.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Perfect. Yep.
And do you sometimes have students who may think or say they're not a Christian and they don't have a Christian worldview? And how do you challenge them and how do you bring them around?
Well, I think one of the first things that has to be established, I do I don't want to call it a pretest, but just a survey, and it's all done anonymously. And one of the things on there, I just write, I'm like, if you may not think you're a Christian, you may be wrestling with it, let me know. We'll work with it. I always let them know there is no question that you can't ask. Any question is open to ask, as long as it's not a gotcha. I've been on a few rodeos before, and I can tell when a student is doing a gotcha. But if someone is sincerely asking and they are questioning, I don't have any problems with that. One of the things I let the students know is that we live in the golden age of apologetics. If you have a question on an issue, Christianity, somebody somewhere has written on it, and I'll get you a resource you need. I'm very blessed also to have a deep bench at my church. So when students send questions to me, I try to keep myself under a shepherd, a pastor who can just take a look at what I would respond and add or correct, because I serve these families and I know that I will be held to account by God for that. And I want to do the best I can. So if someone is struggling, struggle's not a problem. Ask away and we will get you resources. I just want them to feel safe to ask, because one of the things my daughter has shared with me, she has a dear friend who was raised a Christian and is not a Christian anymore. And it's because she said she had questions and nobody would answer them. Mm. And that is the saddest thing to me. So ask away. If you have a question, I will ask questions back. But I also think the student has to demonstrate a willingness to seek. And one of the neat things I see happening with our young men, I'm hearing from parents and from the students themselves, Mrs. Sheridan, how do I handle this situation? They're working with their peers, and they're working with their peers who they work with at Starbucks, who is a neighbor 2 doors down, who's an atheist, people online, and they are willing to begin to engage. And that thrills me, that courage just to step out and answer questions is there. And you don't have to have the answers. I tell them, I may not have the answer to your question, but if I don't, I'll find it for you. And then as they grow, they got to start doing that hard work themselves.
I have heard the same thing about young men, that they're really coming up to step up to the plate. And it's time. It's way past time.
It is. I just don't want to see them staying, as it were, on the front lawn of political conservatism, because politics makes a lousy worldview, as John
it sure does
says. I really believe it is not big enough, comprehensive enough to support life's trials and tragedies and triumphs. We've got to get them inside the church and introduce them to Jesus.
Yeah, I think Charlie Kirk does a great job getting them to the conservative line. But, you look inside TPUSA, his organization, and it worries me, some of the people he has in there evangelizing. And I wish he had more solid people to like you said, take from there and lead these young men and young women into truth and into Christ. So that's certainly something that I pray about. Like I said, I think he does a great job, but he really needs to step up who his staff is and who he has teaching Christianity to people.
Well, and he is one of a myriad of voices, young men. That's the other thing about young men that is so interesting. They are so hungry to hear from men. And whether it be him or Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro, they're hungry and they're looking. And this is why I think, going back to one of the first questions you asked me, why do I think it's necessary to start teaching in middle school? We don't have time to wait anymore.
Yeah, you're right. You're right about that. So you've given a few, but can you give us some real world examples that you use with the kids at different ages? You talked about abortion and stuff, but is there anything that you prepare them? Okay, you're going to be going to college. You may encounter this.
Oh, sure. One of the things I think that is helpful about the culture we live in is that it's constantly coughing up examples. And so I am a big fan of taking media and laying it out, headlines, newspaper headlines, and asking them, okay, you might see a headline that says, the administration upholds transgender surgery for minors who were assigned female at birth. And I'll ask them a question, okay, what idea is smuggled in that headline? And they'll look, and we talk about the fact that the idea that was smuggled in is that your sex is assigned. It's not. And, we take popular phrases and we try to think about, how is the definition of that word changed? Popular press again. What's the difference between a protest and a riot? What does it mean to divorce or decouple? What does it mean to be a baby or a product of conception? So they get used to hearing the jargon that's out there and they think, what do you mean by product of conception? So they can begin to think, even the phrases pro-choice and pro-life. Pro-choice for what? I just want them to begin to start thinking about these things. And, I am very clear with the parents that I don't pull any punches. We're going to talk about what goes on because I can't inoculate them if I don't. And that's another key idea. Part of the reason I teach is to teach kids truth, but you also have to in tandem expose them to the lies that are out there. So they become inoculated so that in the end, they are able to discern the true, the good, and the beautiful from the false, the bad, and the seductive.
Same with theology. You have to expose them to some of the bad so that they
Yes.
can discern it.
Yes, because
Yeah.
obviously there are certain theologies, New Age is one I would think about, that can be very alluring to people. It's nice to be your own God, and obviously we see Islam has many followers, and there's a reason for that. So I want them to understand the belief systems and then be able to compare and contrast and ask the same questions of
Right.
each of these.
Even within evangelicalism, the word of faith movement, if I just believe God is going to give me and God wants me to have the best here on earth. And you're right. You're both right. You got to expose these lies of theology.
Yep. Yep.
Yep.
So you were talking about social media, and do you think it's detrimental for kids to be on social media? What's your view on that? Do you give parents any advice on that?
Technology is such a behemoth. We spend in the last year of biblical worldview spending time talking about technology. Technology to me, it is probably my primary concern for adults and our young people moving forward, especially in the area of biomedical, because technology is going to be posing questions to us from a standpoint that our ethical thinking is now outpaced by. We are able to do things now that we have not stopped to contemplate. And when I think about technology, social media aside, I worry that people who are 12, 13, 14, 15, and kids mature at different rates, don't again have the critical thinking skills developed to handle all that they're seeing, to be able to tell reality from truth. I have parents that ask that question. How do I tell truth from from lies anymore? And I don't know as a 14, 15-year-old is equipped with the ability to do that. They haven't lived long enough. But I also see that we live in a culture where efficiency and the ability to get things done easily is so highly valued that I think we are suffering as a result of it. Even if we look at things like the chat bots now and AI and what that's doing to the educational project regarding, especially in the humanities, what it's doing regarding the cheating epidemic. That really concerns me. And in the years ahead, one of the things I've told the students, the two areas you are going to wrestle with as adults, and you'll be dealing with this with your own children in the area of biomedical, ethical things, the idea that not everything we can do, we should do. And it is Christians who have a toolbox with Christian ethics, which grounds our standard of right and wrong in the character of God. We're either moving toward him or away from him regarding what is right, what we should, what we ought. Christians alone have a toolbox that can address these issues, because you're not going to get the shoulds or the oughts from any other worldview. And I think Christianity is so pivotal moving forward. So the era of that and the area of biblical sexual ethics, we are not done wrestling with the carnage that will be left in the wake. And I'm not sure, combined with technology yet, that we have seen the end of all of this destruction.
Oh, I would say we definitely haven't. And with AI, we really have to question what is true, even with what we're seeing, because they can do so many things with pictures.
And even with voices, somebody posted, they said was a sermon by Dr. Vodi Bakum. And I listened and it was his voice, but I knew immediately it was AI because he's very passionate when he speaks and he's up and down, and this was a little bit more monotone, but they take someone's voice and they do a whole recording of it.
And it won't be long until they will be able to duplicate what he does.
Right.
Exactly.
And this again is why I think God's word is the total package. It has something to say in every area. And as long as we are marinating in that and we are grounded in it, it is our sanity. And in a culture that has severed itself from the author of truth, the farther we get away from God's word, I do believe the closer that we do dance with insanity.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Exactly.
Besides three of my grandkids and some of their friends, as a matter of fact, we were at my granddaughter Lily's rugby game. You were there too. And her boyfriend came up to me and said, "You got to get Mrs. Sheridan on your podcast." But I've been to a couple Wisdom Builder graduations because I've had two granddaughters graduate now. And and student after student mention you and the impact you have on their life. And I'm certainly not putting down other teachers, but yours is the name that keeps coming up and coming up. And I know you're very humble and all the glory to God, but that is amazing. I mean, to hear the impact you're having and for God to give you that kind of encouragement that he's blessing what you're doing is has to be amazing. And I'm curious if you hear from you mentioned a couple, but students come back and tell you things. Do they tell you the difference you've made in their life? Do their parents tell you?
But that's not a whole lot. I'm not comfortable talking with that about that, just because it's a mantle to me. It kind of gets me emotional. It's a serious thing. I take very seriously the trust that the parents give me. Um, and I serve. They direct the education, and I'm privileged just to have an opportunity. And it is a sad thing for me, like to watch Lily walk away. There's a little bit of your heart that goes with them. Some of these kids have studied with me 5 and 6 years, and you get to know them as people. And it's fun when they come back. My husband and I have a game night in our home, and students who have graduated come back, and we just have dinner and talk. And it's kind of fun to watch them walk through life. And our students will stop by who I haven't seen in a year or two and just need some counsel about something, and they're laying across the couch, and it's like it's fun. And I never envisioned this happening. And this is, I think, also a real life lesson for me. My husband and I were married 15 years, and as I said, we adopted our daughter, and we wanted to have more. And I can very distinctly remember the afternoon. My daughter was maybe 3. We put our paperwork in for a second child to adopt from China, and I very clearly heard the Lord say to me, "I want you to let this dream die." And I just remember sitting down in the bed and weeping. But I have had so many people say to me, "Oh, you're such a spiritual mom to my son or to my daughter." And the Lord is just always faithful. And I can look back now and realize that he closed that door because he has work to do. And I realize that this window will close. This won't go on forever, but boy, I sure enjoy the sweet spot while I'm in it. And I pray that when the Lord moves me on to whatever he has next, that he will be as gracious to me in allowing me to spend time with other people.
And it's obvious that you enjoy it and that you love the Lord and these kids. So, what about future plans?
This is something I reevaluate year by year and just talk with them. What would you like me to do this year? I don't, in the foreseeable future, feel that I have permission to leave or go and do anything else. So that may change in 5 years or so, but right now I am where he's planted me, and I don't feel any direction that he wants to move me. So I'll continue investing as long as he'd like me to.
Would you consider writing out like formal curriculum for other teachers to use?
No, when, I like to think I don't have an original thought. My life is a doorway through which information passes to students. That's my calling, to take what is out there and make it understandable. And there is so much amazing content that's out there now. I would have nothing if it wasn't for Summit Ministries. Their curriculum is phenomenal. And I'll take the opportunity also to plug their 2-week, they have a 2-week session for students age 16 to 25 where you can go out to Colorado and get intensive worldview training from the premier teachers in the field, like on abortion, on marriage. And it's an opportunity to ask questions of the people they see on the screen who might be in a video. And any of the students that I've sent, including my daughter twice, have absolutely loved it. And
My granddaughter Lily has gone.
Yeah, it's just been life-changing, and they are so invested in young people. Dr. David Noble, who began this whole thing I want to say over 30 years ago, they're still in Manitou Springs in Colorado, and I think they've had 1 million kids come through now. I mean, young men get leave from the armed forces to come. It's just very, very encouraging, and I pray God will bless them richly.
Rose, we need to link that
Yeah. Can you send me a link for that, Anne? And we'll link it in the show notes if parents would like
Be happy
to
to.
find out more. So for parents who have their kids in public school whose kids aren't getting Christian worldview classes, what advice can you give parents about teaching their kids how to critically think?
I would ask them to, there are several organizations that you can hook up with. I would say Summit is one. I think the Colson Center for Christian Worldview does a beautiful job. And I think there are several organizations that are putting out media that's very helpful in thinking and asking good questions. What would you say.org is another excellent organization, and they do 3-minute videos on cultural topics from a Christian worldview, and they do it with 3 bullet points. So whatever it might be euthanasia, it might be why does God care about marriage? Everything that's out there, and you just come away with 3 things to remember. So that's a conversation starter. And I can't recommend enough. I know they tend to be more political in nature, but I show an awful lot of Prager videos in my class, also PragerU, because I think they do an excellent job
Yeah.
at dealing with issues concretely with experts in the field. And Summit, they've asked Summit to speak. Several of their speakers have made videos. So I've been very happy with that.
We'll
Yep.
try to put some of those links
Yes.
into what was the website you said that does the 3-minute videos?
What would you say.org? I
Okay.
have a sheet here of, I will attach to you when I have done speaking at like a women's retreat. I have a suggested resources page. I'll just send it to you.
That would be fabulous.
Yeah, that's perfect. Perfect.
We'll put that in the show notes. Well, Anne, thank you for your time. We appreciate it. A lot of wisdom, a lot of good advice for parents and for kids. My grandkids listen to this. So James, who's only middle school, he knows what's coming. I'm sure he's going to be excited.
Shout
Oh,
out.
I'm sure they're going to love it.
Well, thank you for your time. This was a blessing to me, and I appreciate what you all are doing, and pray God will bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you.
a blessed day, everyone.
And give him the